Good morning, everybody. That's better. My name's Martin Clark. I'm the director here at Bergen Kunsthall. I saw some of you last night for the first session of these Bergen Sessions. But for those of you who I didn't see, I just want to welcome everybody here today. We're very pleased that you could all come. The Bergen Sessions are the third part of a three-part project that we've been hosting here at Bergen Kunsthall over the last few weeks. And it's a project by the French-American artist Eric Baudelaire, who is here with us in the audience, and I'm sure will be featuring as part of the conversations today. The session last night was a conversation between Eric and Kim West, and it was a really fantastic session actually, where they both talked in quite some detail about both the film downstairs and the project in its broader sense, the Secession Sessions. I think we filmed it and it was streamed, so it is available online. If people weren't here and you want to look at that session, you'll be able to access it from the website, from Bergen Kunsthall website. As I say, it's a three-part project. In number 5, we have, at the moment, the Abkhazian embassy, and we're delighted as well that we have Maxim Gvinjia here, who's come all the way from Abkhazia to be with us as the ambassador of Abkhazia, really to meet with people and to talk, and again, we heard a little bit about that last night, and to represent in a kind of broad and unofficial capacity some of the questions and some of the issues that are raised through the Secession Sessions project. The other part of the project is a film which Eric made, which is also being screened daily in the same space in number 5. I hope that many of you have had an opportunity to see that. If not, I'm sure it will be being screened today. I think that's right, isn't it, Steiner? So if people do want to, either after the sessions or at lunchtime, go and look at that film, it will be on. And the third part of the project is what we're at today. It's the Bergen Sessions, and it's an opportunity for a series of conversations, discussions and dialogues around the project, around the film, but in its broadest sense. That's probably all I need to say. I'm going to hand you over now to Steiner Sekkingstad, who curated the project with Eric and has been working on it over the last year or so. He's going to introduce the first sessions. Later on in the day, Julie Lillian-Porter will also be saying a few words and introducing some of the sessions. And Julie has worked very much on this aspect, the Bergen Sessions. So I'm going to pass over to Steiner. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Welcome to everyone. Just to give a few very practical things first. Martin already touched upon it. This week, Maxim has been the main part of the exhibition project, hosting the embassy downstairs in the space. But today the exhibition is back to a screening room again, so the whole of the day there's possibilities to see the film. Whereas tomorrow the embassy will be open again, and with one last screening at 3 o'clock of the film. So you know the last opportunity is to see the film in the exhibition. And today you will see on your handouts the program for today, and there's also a lunch that everyone is invited to. That would happen in the space next door upstairs here. So there's we can just stay in here all day, and there's coffee and fruits and water arriving soon up here as well, if you feel the need for that. And there's also a toilet right in next door here, and also downstairs. As Martin also mentioned, we are live streaming, and parts of the sessions today will be streamed and broadcast at Beton Salon in Paris today. This whole exhibition is a collaboration with the Beton Salon in Paris, where Maxim has also been for the last month. But to today's program, as Martin mentioned yesterday, the conversation between Eric and Kim West was kind of drawing up the whole perspectives and the different parts of the totality of the project, but focusing mainly on the film itself and the film practice of Eric Baudelaire. But with this morning's first sessions, we are focusing more on the theme of Abkhazia and the context for the exhibition, probably. It's a conversation between Maxim Gvinjia and Colm. Maxim, as you probably already know now, is the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Abkhazia, and the main character and subject in a way of Eric's film. Leon Colm is a doctorate from Oxford University. He has traveled a lot and written about several of the de facto states after the Soviet Union. Also Abkhazia, several books in English and also one essay in French specifically about Abkhazia. So with that, I'll just hand it over to you. We have about 1 hour in our program for this session. I'm not sure if we are a bit behind now, but at some point I will give a signal and we can open up for questions at the end of the conversation. Okay.
Max. So thank you, I guess. Thank you first to the Kunsthall for the hospitality and the invitation and the generosity and etc. I think it's quite unusual to be here in front of this beautiful scenery talking about Abkhazia. Let's not ever use the word Abkhazia.
No, I agree.
Well, let's not talk about Abkhazia at all, actually.
Yes.
We could talk about whatever.
Yes, because we spoke about Abkhazia for so long
Oh,
already.
enough of Abkhazia, seriously.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something different.
Something different.
Like not about this.
Yeah. To summarize about Abkhazia, so it's exactly like Bergen,
Better weather.
but a bit better weather.
Yeah. Tiny bit better.
Tiny bit
And
better.
dolphins kind of in the...
Yeah.
it's not like this, actually, at all. But... so we'll not use the word Abkhazia. There's two stories, basically two stories, but I have a couple questions maybe to ask myself. I'm not going to... we did this in Paris and I talked too much, so I'm not going to talk as much. But there's basically two big stories here. Three, maybe. All right. First is the story of the Soviet collapse. 15 countries emerged from the Soviet Union. New flags went up. These countries joined the United Nations. But inside that kind of tale, this of politics, basically, which we all agree to, there's these little stories about these states which exist, which are self-declared, which live in the cracks, right? So if you imagine, in an atlas, whenever you're looking for that particular place, it's always in the crack. Well, these are countries which live in the cracks, in the geopolitical cracks of the world. They exist, but they're not recognized legally, right? So they're not represented in the United Nations. So our idea originally with Eric was to go to these places, see what does it look like? Because there's not many pirate dens left in the world. There's not many zones which are off the map, in a way. Every bit of the world's territory is covered with a stamp of the state, right? With a flag and an anthem, etc. And here they are too, but they're not recognized. There's something special there. The second story is of the state, right? Which is this: we are all. Eric talked about this last night, but we are all state citizens. We're brought up as with numbers when we're young. We're stamped by the state, with passports and identification numbers. The way we see history is taught in schools through the perspective of the state. The way we understand everything about the relationship between space and power, between territory and time, is through the state perspective. So one of the questions we were asking was, how do you understand that, right? And the way to do it is to get into these little stories, to go to a place where the state is being born, where it's not taken for granted in such a way that we have. It's hard to talk about Norwegian state because it's kind of sitting on top of us, right? Not only that, but it's actually in our minds. So we go to a place like Abkhazia or other places where that's a bit more evident, right? Where you can see the seams of the state. All right, so that was the initial impetus too. So those two big stories that we were exploring, and Max kind of brings them together. All right, so he's the meeting point of this 20-year process of Soviet collapse and the creation of new states, and also a man of the state, right? Of a kind of a new state emerging, who can tell us about what it means to be a state, a citizen of a state.
But even those who live in these states, these emergent states, there are many emergent states, and they're recognized, and they're new, they're fresh. But if you ask people from these states, do they really realize what is happening, or do they take in it as maybe it's just too much emotions in these new states, maybe it's too much of patriotic feelings, but generally people just, they don't realize what they're doing, they just leave. They do this everyday project like in many other places in the world, but this process for them is more vital, is more touching. They live through this process every day, and every single new thing that appears in their state, it makes them happy. But it may be exactly like in Norway, like 150 years ago, when Norwegian state was in the process of creating. So I don't think that we really kind of realize what we're doing, because this process is very natural. The way we live, the way we build, the way we try to achieve something for our state. Every single little thing makes you happy. It's like a little baby. When you bring up little baby, the first words he says, you remember these first words. The first step he makes, you remember these first steps. They make you happy. But then child just get older, and then they turn into a person, and it's a natural process. You never think about it, kind of.
But that was the idea, was to go to a place where a state was being born, right? To go and the thing about Abkhazia is it does have that kind of, it does reveal things which are very hard to see here, right? About like Eric was talking about this yesterday, but there, you know, the institutions of a state here are so dominant that it's very hard to understand what is the place that the state has in our mind. But in Abkhazia, there's very weak institutions. I mean, the state here is all these street lights and taxes and everything that you pay, and it's kind of this organization. Abkhazia doesn't really have that. So something revealing, naked about going to Abkhazia. You think, well, wow, you know, so what's the state? It's actually in this mental belief, right, that people have.
You're right, absolutely. It's a collective belief, yes, but at the same time, you're right. In Abkhazia, you can already no longer see it as in the past. Now the state is becoming more and more covered with all these rituals and facade of all these state things. Kind of, you already don't have access to politicians like in the past. You could come to any office. You still can meet president somewhere, but not in the cafe or in the street like in the past.
You know, talking about meeting politicians, because this may be interesting, the history of our relationship, as Eric described his yesterday, but we met when Max was working at the ministry as a counselor, and then I was a university lecturer in the United Kingdom. And we became good friends. This was 14 years ago. And then slowly, there's been several phases in this relationship. But for 3 or 4 years, it was sort of in that phase when it was free, right? There were no representational problems in terms of my presence in Abkhazia and yours with mine in a way. But you moved up in the ministry, eventually to become the foreign minister, but before that you were deputy foreign minister. Meanwhile, I left academia and I joined international organizations, and I ended up working on Abkhazia itself, on conflict resolution. And so it became complicated because we were these good friends, but we met across the negotiation. In 2008, there was the war between Russia and Georgia, and I was involved in the negotiations, was followed with Max. So sitting across the table from him, ostensibly really representing completely different perspective, huh? Because the organizations I was working for prefer state sovereignty. They don't like separatist movements. Not at all. It's disorderly, right? Forget about the justice of it. So it was very complicated in terms of like the mixture of politics and friendship, in a way, right? And we never told anybody about this.
We couldn't show up.
It was a bit serious kind of situations. In Geneva, in very dark paneled rooms, very tense, fighting over every detail. Very complicated. But now, Max, we're no longer representing anything. I don't work on Abkhazia anymore. You no longer a foreign minister.
Yeah.
But then the question is, like, you've been here for a week and 1 month in Paris, being this an ambassador. I can't even say it. An ambassador. What is this? So are you again? What are you representing, and what have you been representing now for? Because you were a foreign minister. So what's an ambassador?
It's just the kind of stepping down in position, but I think it's even promotion. Every minister would always dream to get rid of all his official positions under which he has to hide, and just to be honest and talk about many things and criticize many things back at home, or trying to find a new perspective for a country. So it's good, it's even better.
Okay, but wait a second. This last month you've been representing Abkhazia?
Yes, I was represented, but even if you come to Abkhazia and we build an office like this and we even call it an embassy, believe me, people will come and they will believe that you're representing a country from where you come from, and they will ask you a lot of questions, especially political questions. Why France don't recognize Abkhazia? Something like this. But in reality, we always represent. But in my case, I represented with an embassy and this beautiful small office and the movie.
So Max, when you walk in there, do you call this your office? This is actually, this is your office?
Yes.
You're not working in a gallery in this kind of strange plywood
no, this is
it's an office, and you receive people?
It's my office, and people working in Kunsthall are my office colleagues.
Team, right?
My team.
You can get coffee for us, please. Okay,
Sorry.
but that's kind of strange, huh?
Yeah, but every place where you come, you have to accept it, and you have to be there, because usually you have this philosophic problem sometimes when we do something and we don't want really to belong to the place, or we don't really want to do something when we do something. But when you get to anywhere, you have to live there, you have to do it. But in my case, I don't have. It's not that I have to, but I enjoy it. It's something new in my career. And believe me, I will put somewhere in my CV that I was an ambassador.
Okay, but you're a foreign minister, a real foreign minister, who's now become an ambassador, which doesn't exist. It's a term invented, all right? Representing a country which does exist, but it's not recognized because it's seen as being fictional. It's a bit complicated, right, in terms of the layers of representation.
It also can show all this complexity of all of the world and the life. Everything is kind of relevant, or everything is fiction, and at the same time everything is real. You can never say. We can be whoever. We can be given a title. Like a lot of people, musicians, are given some title to be ambassadors. Okay. And they just represent a goodwill ambassador or whatever.
Okay, about the film, if I can ask you, you received these, because we talked about it a little bit yesterday, but these letters, Max, when you were, you push this recorder, you get a letter, you open it, and I don't know whether everybody's seen this film, but you record this letter, all right? You record your response. I imagine you were probably alone when you did this, huh? Like people not around.
Yeah, sure, but
where were you? I mean, what were you doing this for? In your mind, were you doing this for? It was a game, or was it kind of like maybe for posterity? What were you imagining in the answers? What were you thinking?
But when I was doing this, yes, it was kind of a game more.
It was kind of fun.
It was fun. It was exciting. But when I was recording, I didn't think about the movie at all.
Did you know they were going to a movie?
Yes.
But so you knew that this intimate answers were going to be public, right?
I had no idea what he will do with this, and I mean Eric, and how he's going to work with his recordings. And I just made it. I didn't think about movie at all.
Okay, but still you were aware that this would become a public event. So you were representing in a way, huh?
Yes,
would you have given different answers if you just thought this is just for my friend Eric?
But I actually gave him such answers there because I started to forget that when I started to record, and I was trying to answer the question, and then I realized that it's so interesting to talk to myself through the recorder. So next time, if anybody of you have some problems or you have a question or some, try to record yourself. Try to speak to recorder. It will help. You don't necessarily need to listen afterwards to what you recorded, but try to articulate in the words what is bothering you, or if you have some ideas, just try to explain, articulate them, and you will find it very funny and very easy sometimes to find a solution. People pay, so a lot of money to go to analysis, whatever, but try to analyze yourself. And I think we all people will have this potential to resolve a lot of problems by our own, because we're created by nature like this. I think everything is natural, even these state buildings and desires for freedom, independence, or separatism, and then reunification, and then changing of the borders. It's always kind of historical processes, and it's all based on the people's instincts, and something which is hidden somewhere deep inside us.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, I mean, really,
Yeah,
but you're saying, all right, there's the desire for freedom, for non-oppression, or etc., is something which is deeply instinctively, right, communally based, right? It's you, it's your family, it's your community. Right?
It can start with
the
a
state,
person.
but Max, the state is something which is instinctive to us.
Yes.
Like to create something which has a president and these strange parliamentary systems, and then parties. And
No, it's already kind of
what is that?
The system, the political system, is like a fashion. When you create a state, and then you have to try to look like every other state, so you create it. But why not to create monarchy, for example? It could be like, let's say we have a queen or a king. Why not? But then if you create a monarchy, everybody would say, well, it's not a democracy, you created a monarchy, because you play in a fashion. And every time when Abkhazia, when we created our state, it was so great, it was just new, and we could do everything. Why didn't we make monarchy? I still don't understand.
Yeah, but people here, like in other countries, would say, okay, but our problem, my problem with freedom here, and maybe in Norway, in France, or in Ireland, is the state. The state is the problem, right? State control, state surveillance, state, and then we look at you and we think, God, why did they? 1992, they had this moment of freedom, right? Revolution. They could do what they wanted. Maybe create a monarchy, although, but maybe why didn't they do something else? Why did they create the very institution which we hate? For most people, distrust it. Some people hate it intensely. Most people try and get it as much as possible out of their life. And then Abkhazia, which is this incredible, unique opportunity, goes off and creates this thing which we, think, well, you're crazy. 20 years later, you're just gonna have problems with the secret police, and they're gonna monitor you, and they're gonna be corrupt, and they're gonna, etc. Why? There's something. I'm just quite asking, if you could do differently, right? Would you create a state? I understand there's only states left, huh? There's no other choice. But couldn't you do something different?
We would do monarchy. I would do monarchy. And maybe proclaim myself as first king. I'm joking. But it's states and people, nations, they're like children. You bring up children, you tell them not to do this, yeah, and they do. They repeat all the mistakes. It's a historical. Every nation has to pass all these problems. You cannot. Okay, today we just can imagine we invent a nation appearing out of a crisis. Like recently there was South Sudan, the newest country.
Yeah.
But still they come through same mistakes. They come through.
Because once you launch the state, I mean, once it's, I know it's a structure, a political structure. Once you launch it, what we see, you know, in states which are more established, is that it's a logic, right? It's like it's a way of, Bourdieu called it a habitus. It's a way of thinking. It like starts to organize how you understand and perceive your relationship with the world, your relationship with other people, your relationship with territory, land becomes territory all of a sudden, your relationship to your identity, which becomes certified and numbered, etc. I mean, it's really a logic, and I can see this in Abkhazia now, 20 years later. You have this kind of, you know, you think, God, you know, maybe we could have done something different there, not that, you know. When I was in Abkhazia, I taught I don't, maybe you weren't there that day, but I remember giving a lecture. I went to the Abkhaz State University to speak to students. My goal was to, first of all, talk about the state with them, but also ask them what they thought the state was. Right? So at the beginning of the class, I said, okay, so let's, tell me, what is a state? And then the second question was, what is Abkhazia? To try and see the disjunctions here. And I think I have, okay, here's some answers of what is a state. A state is an independent country. Okay, fine. State is a sovereign country. State is security. A state is a people, a land, borders, and a constitution. So it's all about institutions. Huh? It's like power. It's about power, basically. Then what is Abkhazia? And it's a very different answer. Huh? Abkhazia is my home. Abkhazia is part of me. Abkhazia is the nation I hold in my heart. Abkhazia is the most beautiful country in the world. But yeah, it could be, actually. It might be. And it's also a place of the soul. There's a disjunction there, no? And then when you marry these two, I mean, this is a disjunction I think we, as human beings, feel, right? Between the institutions of power which structure our lives, and then our relationship with this imagined community, which is our family, and this imagined territory, which is this land we inhabit, right? I don't think the students were tragically desperate because of that disjunction between the two, right? But I think there is a gap there, a little bit, no? What's the state for you, Max?
It's natural. It's all same. It's a place to which I belong. It's my home. Yeah, that's what my state is for me. But this is something to where I belong to. There's something where. But even if I don't live in Abkhazia, I would know that this is a place where I belong to. I can always return, like home. It might be state. It might not be state. It could be your favorite city, or it would be your block where you live, and it could be your motherland. But in reality, the state, you never think about it as the state is there, whatever. You just, well, I tell you my impressions when I cross the border.
What do you think?
I immediately feel kind of relaxed. Everything is easy, and even air is different in my country.
It's
just
better?
after I cross it's better. Water is sweeter, and people like you want to hug all of them. You know, the taxi drivers, it's funnier. You know, they tell you the freshest anecdotes.
Okay. But Max, the story of the state is something which is heroic. And what you're saying is a kind of human, the history of a state is this heroic narrative of necessity, right? The state has to be, it needs to be to protect the people because in historical, you know, it has this antecedence historically, etc. Now, at the human level, the relationship with the state is one you describe. It's this kind of feeling of home, of being, you know, belonging, basically, right? But in the film, and this is what's interesting, it's not that clear in the film. Like, there's an uncertainty about the whole thing. No, there's an uncertainty. It's not just the uncertainty of weak institutions in Abkhazia, which are still very weak structurally in terms of the presence of people's lives. But there's a kind of fundamental uncertainty there, no, about life. It doesn't feel as firm, no, why is that? Is it because the institutions are weak that people have to only believe in the state, so there's only belief? I don't know, I'm just trying to understand it. And it's not like the film doesn't portray this kind of, we were talking about it yesterday, the birth of the nation, this necessity-driven historical process of Abkhaz statehood. It's not the point of the movie. But
maybe it's good. Maybe it's good that we're not so much preoccupied now about all this symbolics, and that we're more concentrated on just living, just being citizens of the country. Maybe sometimes it's just a best contribution every person can do for his country, just to be living there and to enjoy this, to be positive walking in the streets. That's what I try to convince a lot of young people in Abkhazia when I meet them, because I think they're very much politicized and they think a lot about the state and everything, but I tell them, listen, just relax. It's the best contribution you can do. Just live in your country, take it easy, enjoy life, go fishing, don't be nervous. I mean, I think young people, it's also very important for young people in the country. Yeah, they should be kind of patriotic, but not too much. They should just enjoy life. This is the best contribution they can do for their country. If you see them smiling in the streets, if you see them trying themselves in different arts, on many other very creative, interesting things. But this is important about the modern state and about free state, when people are free, when they just enjoy life in this country.
Yeah.
This is the goal. I mean, what everything is made for, why people make states and why states are functioning. What is it for? Is it just because of desire to be free, or because this, heroic past in the war people fought? Yes, we remember all these things. Sometimes I think we too much remember all these things. Maybe we shouldn't forget, but we should try to transform into something else. We cannot be walking forward, looking back. I mean, we have to look in the future now. And what is it all for? And why these states? And what are the states? And I think in reality, the overall goal is that people will live normally and don't think about state or whatever. They would just enjoy life there.
Okay, that's a. But what if you, Max, if we did a spoof of this film, right? We took this film and we called it Lost Letters to Pierre, right? And it was you sending these letters from Abkhazia to a guy living in Paris, right? Asking him these strange questions, okay? And then this person, you go to Paris to film Pierre, right? And his landscapes. And he, meanwhile, has recorded these things, right? Would you have, I'm just wondering, would it be the same film? Would you get the same kind of deep melancholy, all right? Deep uncertainty about Pierre's relationship with the state? Do you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, looking around, wondering what the hell is all this? Finally, what the fuck is the state? I'm just wondering, like, okay, so Abkhazia the question I guess is Abkhazia special, or is it just sui generis, or does it kind of exist as like a satellite way out, very different from Earth? Or is it like us, like you could do the same film about Norway and call it Lost Letters to Steiner, or something like that, and you'd get to this kind of, you'd highlight all these disjunctions in people's relationship with history, people's relationship with territory, their identity, etc. And also the kind of, this kind of slight melancholy we all feel and nostalgia for the past, which is natural, right? We're human beings, we move on, and the past always looks golden and rosy, right? Do you think? Could we do this film?
Yes, I think so. It could be, it's possible to make, well, not same film, but to discover same kind of character, melancholy in the movie about Bergen or Norway or even Paris. It doesn't matter. It's just when you start to think about it, and if you ask yourself right now, even right now, just what is the state and how you live in that state and what is your relation to the state, it could be same to any other place.
Okay. The one thing about Abkhazia, I think it has to be really clear, is, and we'll stop there, Abkhazia is beautiful, okay, in terms of the landscape. It's got mountains which comes to the sea. It's the Black Seas right there, which is a really interesting sea. It's a violent sea, it's a very calm sea. it's got this sublime nature, right? So when you travel in Abkhazia, you experience nature in this very raw, unmoderated form, right? Especially because it's all ruins, etc. A lot of ruins are still left from the war, so it's kind of savage. So in that context, I often wondered myself, and I'll stop there. Maybe you want to continue, but there was kind of it seemed like human ambition is poor relative, right, to this incredible, breathtaking, nature which lives there. And especially human projects such as statehood, which are exclusive, always exclusion, always about power, always about security and military force, essentially, when you get down to it. It's about protecting from another, right? Seemed a bit of a shame somehow. I couldn't help, and maybe that's part of the melancholy of this film, is this kind of relationship, this incredible, sublime being relative to our scrambling ambitions, which will disappear and leave no trace, or these kind of ruins, monuments from Tsarist or Soviet or whatever era from the war.
Yeah, the 90% of what we have is given to us by God, by nature. We didn't construct anything. We didn't do anything. It's just this place, this land, the territory called Abkhazia. And in the movie, I also mention it. It's like a code which is already installed in us to live on this land, and if something happens, we go protect it. It never came to us like a secession movement which is fighting for a separation. When the war started, just people immediately turned into this understanding that, well, they have to go and protect. There was nobody. Yeah, there was statement on the TV, but in reality, nobody said, "Hey, go, just get united. We have to fight for it." No, just everybody just went.
Maybe that's a good place to open up for questions. Does anyone want to ask Max and Leon something now for this part? There will be a wrap-up session with everyone at the very end of the day, but if there's someone who wants to respond to any of this right now, yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. Let's see how it turns out. So when you were talking about the responses from students about what is Abkhazia versus what is a nation state, to me that very clearly delineates between responses that are private and responses that are public. And to me, listening to your conversation, I'm also seeing these or negotiations of private identity versus public identity. And listening to you talk about your project, I think this line between private and public is really important. And to me, in a way, listening to you, the more I listen to you, the more I read this project as a negotiation of identity, and your relationships, I read it as a collective negotiation of identity. And it made me think of this text by Russian curator Victor Misiano, which is called Institutionalization of Friendship. And to me, it's very much about what I'm seeing is the three of you going through this beautiful journey that's very personal, but in a way holding on to these, the apparatus of the state to guide you through it. And I just wondered if you have thought of it in that way. In a way, if one wanted to, you could read this very much from a feminist perspective, kind of seeing these three men going through a very beautiful personal journey, but clinging on to the kind of infrastructure of patriarchy, in a way. And I just wondered if you could comment on that at all.
This is really interesting. I never thought of it, I must admit. No, not from that perspective, but also this idea of, I think the subtext, it wasn't specifically about negotiating identities, but part of the grain, the sand in this machine, which has been this project over years, has been exactly that. You put your finger on this notion of us constantly asking ourselves, so who are we, what are we, who are we in relation to this, to our own experiences and to our own identities, our own histories, which I think in each of these cases is a bit in each of our cases is very different, but also very complex. And it's been probably the problématique of the whole issue in a way, and very literally sometimes a problem. I think sometimes a problem for me at least. Max?
Yeah, it's very deep. You know, I never think about such things. I feel shame, you know, sometimes, because even here during the meetings, it's like I learn a lot of new things now, but I never thought about it.
But you know, this where we were hanging, were we hanging on to the apparatus? Maybe I have to think about that. I don't know. But maybe Eric wants to say something on this too, and maybe.
I think two things. One is, I think I started out the project very much in the place which Max just described a second ago, of I don't think about these things. And I think it's very common that you don't think about the things that characterize the you don't theorize your own environment necessarily unless you're confronted with an issue. And the issue or the problem or an uncomfortable relationship to your own environment allows you to start questioning it. And I don't think we, maybe partially because of our background, both Leon and I are people who have a somewhat fragmented national identity, because Leon is Irish and American. I am French, but I spent half of my life in the United States. So I think we already had a little bit of a state schizophrenia going on, of not knowing exactly, you know, passing as an American but not feeling American was something that maybe triggered a discussion amongst ourselves about national belonging, and then going to Karabakh or Pridnestrovye or Abkhazia and seeing this very different relationship to the state. I think it was about starting to question the intensity that we were seeing in the definition of statehood in front of us, and then thinking back about our own environments. But the other thing I wanted to say in reference to the conversation was the difference between there's something necessarily utopian about the project of creating a state, because you don't create a state if you don't have a vision, a utopic vision of what this is going to be. And think the first trip was in 2000, so it's 7 years after the war. The ashes are almost still hot, and the country is still an absolute post-conflict zone. And then we go back every few years, and gradually the things settle, and the war is a more and more distant memory. Now it's a 20-year-old memory. And I wanted to ask, or just sort of bring up the question of the difference between this utopic idea of Abkhazia, where everything is possible and things could be reinvented in a very positive way, in our early discussions 15 years ago, and how that utopia has stood up to the reality today, where invariably 20 years later, you know, the war is a more distant memory. It starts to be a little bit something that people hold on to, perhaps for the wrong reasons. I've noticed in the past few years a lot of monuments celebrating the war are being built now, much, much later. And inevitably you have, you know, a state that is confronted with the same corruption that you have in any other state, the people working for their own interests and not necessarily for the state's interests. And I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit about the difference between the utopic idea that was present years ago and how that rubs up against the reality of something that obviously, like all utopias, doesn't materialize.
Absolutely right. Yeah, but it's to make complex stories simple. It's like I feel guilty for not going to gym. When I see people jogging in the morning, I feel guilty. For me, to do gym is a utopian imagination about me being fit, you know, being physically beautiful. So I don't do it, but every day I tell to myself, I will do tomorrow, I'll do tomorrow, I'll do tomorrow, and I'll give up smoking tomorrow, and I'll give up drinking tomorrow, and I'll become a better person tomorrow. But I don't do it. So it's a utopian imagination about myself. It's also same about the state. And usually when I criticize ourselves in Abkhazia, I will say, why don't we do it? We had the very beautiful plan and vision in the mind. Why don't we just make it happen? And then I compare it to myself, and I realize that yes, we just what we are.
But there's several problems. One is the problem with the gap between the heroic, beautiful, glorious imagination which drives the state, and then the reality. You're walking through streets which are still half destroyed in some cases, and you know, the people have to kind of sustain this, suspend their disbelief continually, right? Say that actually this is actually worth it, but look at it, doesn't look like it's worth it. Then there's the other one which has to do with time and history. That it comes out in the film. There's an incredible melancholy and nostalgia for Soviet past, of when it was multicultural, when people lived together very well, and everybody sort of, everybody was brothers and sisters, and and everybody says, God, the past was great. Before the war was really, there's this kind of gap. Before the war was just a wow. And it makes me think like, so why did you have a war? What happened there? Again, that reflects this gap between what they're experiencing right today, because I think, there's terrible schizophrenias here, in a way, that you're walking around with kind of thinking the past is better than the present, because the present is a bit impoverished relative to multiculturalism and multilingualism, right? And the present is a bit impoverished in terms of institutions and statehood, etc. Hard.
All right, we have 2 questions. We might have time for just those 2, and then
Sure.
wrap it up.
I wanted to talk about etymologies, because there's a lot of that going on with an ambassador, utopia, but also Abkhazia. I was wondering what that word means. Ab seems to suggest away from, Khazia, maybe something not unlike Kazakhstan. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. And then my other question was, one definition of state or maybe nationhood often has to do with foundation myths. And obviously that region is really rich in myths, the Golden Fleece and the Argonauts and whatnot. And I was wondering whether Abkhazia had such myths, which were distinct from the Georgian ones.
Yeah, the myths are many, but Abkhazia, it's kind of conventional name. In Abkhazia, we always have 2 names for everything, even for people. People have 2 names. Some name they use in public and some name in passport. But I don't know, it's kind of a tradition. It turned out to be a tradition. I don't know why is that.
So what are your 2 names?
My another name is Maja, but it's my family. They call me sometime like this. But I'm more Max in Abkhazia than Maja. But my other friends, I knew them all like for 20 years. I knew them as somebody, and then we go to airport to board on the airplane, and I see his passport. What is this? Why didn't you tell me your name is this? I mean, it's a great shock, but no, joking. But Abkhazia is conventional name, but we also have a very ancient name for our country, which is Apsne. And Apsne, A-P-S-N-Y.
Why? Yeah.
Like my city is called Sukhum, but in Abkhazian it's always been Aqua. So it's always kind of duality in etymology in Abkhazia. We always have another word for many of the things. And the myths, you're right. There are many myths on which we built our new country. I'm not a historian. I cannot find confirmation of many things, but people say yes, it's true. Maybe it's not true. I don't know. But I'm okay with all those myths. But there is one myth which is very peculiar about Abkhazia, It's a myth about how God was given land to different people in the world. So he gave land to Norwegians, to everybody, and he already went to sleep. He was going to sleep. He tied all day. He was given the land to different nations, and suddenly Abkhazian came, and God said, "Listen, you're late. I already gave all land to everybody. Sorry, finished. It's closed." And Abkhaz said, "Listen, sorry. I was so busy. I had guests come into my house. I was busy with my friends. Please give me one land, just one piece of land." He said, "Okay, you're such a nice, generous person. You're meeting guests. So here is a piece of land that I kept for me, where I was going actually to vacate, but have it. So it's yours. But please preserve it." So that's from where we develop this kind of legend that we have to preserve this land. And there is continuation of this legend when God was given brains. And you imagine that Abkhaz decided, okay, last time I came, he gave me best land. This time I come late again and he gives me best brain. And when he came to God, and God said, "Listen, I gave you such a beautiful land, you don't need brains." So it's funny legends about... the second legend is joke, but the first legend is kind of real legend.
Okay, we have one more question, I think.
Thanks. Hello. I guess at some level, the question is stated is, a state is also about collective fantasy or a mental construction in a way. But growing up in Norway, it's hard not to think of some, at least at some point. To me, the state also represents something. It's about stability, at least living in a social democracy as the Scandinavian countries. Statehood is also about this, and I'm very curious because as your country is very special, you talked about it as being an emergent state. I'm curious, how does it affect your life, your ability to plan ahead? How do you plan your life or the lives of your children? How does this question of statehood, and I guess there must be some element of uncertainty involved. How does it involve the way you plan your life and the life for your children? How you perceive time? Does it affect you? Yeah.
Thank you. Very good question, because you're right. The stability, the confidence, I think it's a very important part of every state in the world. I think this is a democracy. When you're confident, when you're stable, when you know, when you plan for your children, when you live freely. That's right. But it came to my country, it came to us in Abkhazia quite recently. Now we are not afraid of any war. And when people are not afraid of war, you immediately can feel how people invest into the future and how they start building plans. It's very interesting, because I saw it. It was really kind of observation for me. How before, when people were preparing for war and they expect some crisis, you pass and there is a shop, yeah, and an owner of a shop, don't do anything, just it's dirty next to shop, there are no flowers, nothing. But then, kind of, sometime after, and there is kind of a reason not to be afraid of the war, and you pass by same shop and you see how the owner of a shop is trying to make it beautiful, is coloring the facade and putting flowers outside, how people start, like with the small things, how they start to invest into future and think about future, and they do this simple small things. They spend their money, and don't have to, but they try to decorate, to make it more beautiful, which means that they start think about future and building plans. But me personally, I don't build any plans. I don't plan anything for 3 months in advance. It's too far for me. I don't have plans. I decided not to plan. It happened one day. Also, something changed, something switched in my mind. So I don't do plans. I don't plan anything. I just bring up children. I enjoy life. Yeah, I could have a plan that next summer I would like to do something, but I don't have this kind of schedule.
Can I say something about the state? I think the question is also about legitimacy of the state, right? So you have the traditional legitimacy was security. The state provided security and order to our lives. It still does, but really the legitimacy of states today is, as you said, this social democratic. It's this kind of technocratic provision of goods and services to the individual. Education, healthcare, these kind of, which are not linked to security. They're other forms of security. But it's kind of the crisis of the state today, not in Norway perhaps, but in continental Europe, we're seeing the rise of non-technocratic political discourse, like the radical right, because they're not talking about how to solve technocratic problems for the provision of these services, but they're talking about identity politics. We're going back to these very frightening forms of legitimacy for a state, which we could be returning to in some cases.
But it's interesting. Many states, if you look at the world map, and it's also observation, and I shared it with many of my friends here. Today's world is not 21st century. Many countries, they're not 21st century. It changes. Like sometimes you return back to 17, 15, 18th century. Sometimes some countries go back in the kind of political development into very, very ancient time, like Romans, like emperors. And some countries you can see very strange things are happening, and the same things happened like 300 years ago, and it was okay for that time. And it's not that all the world is in 21st century. It's not all countries are developing in the same. If you look at the reality of the states today and the internal policy or external policy, and you remove all this modern kind of, lusk, yeah. But in reality, it turns out it's like what we read from history, from ancient Rome or medieval ages. It's also very interesting.
I think Martin also wanted to add something as the final.
Sorry, I know it was meant to be the last question, but it just felt appropriate to say it now, given where the conversation had gone. But I think it's very interesting hearing you talk about that, and just what you said at the very end there as well, Max, because there's this sense that I'm interested in this idea of how the state defines itself through those various fictions that we've all talked about. And often it's to do with where a state is in terms of its development, and whether it's a young state or a much older state. And hearing you talk about that shift through time, and I think it's very interesting. I mean, if you think about the way that some states define themselves very much through a kind of militaristic, they define themselves through their opposition to either oppressors or a recent war or the threat of a war. And we can think of all states at some point having that condition. I mean, I'm from the UK, and I can think about the way that we would define ourselves through our animosity with France for many hundreds of years. But then at a certain moment, that's still there, ingrained in the way that you think about the state and those stories that you tell back to yourselves. But actually, I'm kind of curious about the stories that Abkhazia tells to itself now in the way that it defines itself. Those kind of collective fictions and mythologies, as you said, and stories that maybe, as Eric was kind of alluding to, are you now at a point where you're having to go back to that traumatic militaristic past in order to redefine what you are? Or are you at a point where there are other stories that you can start to tell yourselves collectively that define who you are? And is that a more mature state when you get to that point? I mean, the UK now, the sense of statehood is defined much more through a kind of collective memory of the media, through the kind of the BBC, through a kind of cultural memory, rather than a militaristic one, I guess.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And now I feel in my country there is a lot of efforts to try to find another story. It should be, the warrior past, the heroic past the people start to picture war like something very romantic and heroic, and you run, you shoot your enemies, and music is playing on the background. Well, which is not. But still, we try to make this heroic past and keep it. But now there are a lot of efforts being done to promote another kind of legend, another idea of achievements. That's why sport development and development of art in the country becomes more and more important. So we try to build already idea on the sport achievements and like opera singing or whatever. It's important, you're right.
Okay, I think we have to end there. We'll have a quick changeover, so you could just stay put. But for now, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Maxim and Leon.
Thank you.